So, what happens when you put magical girls and idols into a pot, add a dash of mecha and suffering into the mix, and fill it all up with Yuri, just to take that pot and throw it through a wall? This. Alright, before we get into this, I want to explain that I'll be very biased in this sort of retroactive review I'm doing here. Not only do I only cover anime I've watched a few years back in this series, Symphogear itself is of extremely high importance to me, and I will probably forever see its first 2 seasons with very rose-tinted glasses. You see, Symphogear was my first real gateway anime. It wasn't the first anime I watched, knowing it was an anime. That place belongs to the furry fest that's Tokyo Mew Mew, but it was the first show to really broaden my horizon to the point where I could see the entire medium instead of the endless, wholesome whirlpool of cotton candy and magical girl shows I was watching back then. While definitely not up there with the likes of Madoka or others that came after it, it was the first more serious and somewhat dark and mature show I ever saw, and the world it built really managed to immerse and amaze me. Heck, it still does that today. However, without wanting to say that they're particularly high now, my personal standards were much lower back then. Not only was I a lot younger, just entering puberty, which explains another draw the show had for me, I also hadn't seen nearly as many anime, as is natural for the gateway show of someone who just discovered the medium. I had no sort of will, not to speak of ability, to critically deconstruct the show. I could just lean back, watch it, and enjoy the ride it took me on while my brain built this stunning world in my head. Hey, that's the main reason Sword Art Online gets praised by quote-unquote normies who just discovered anime themselves. While the commonly accepted opinion is a lot more complex, it's an amazing show on the surface and has great entertainment value if you just do what I was forced to do for Symphogear. Don't give a damn, and just enjoy it. Now, engaging with a show as little as I did does come with its issues, the main one being that, even with my undying love for this franchise, until the very rewatch I did when I originally wrote this video, I took a stance that made me ignore some of the greatest strengths of the entirety of Symphogear, even during later seasons when I was at a point in my anime journey where I could totally enjoy those things. Now, with that out of the way, is anyone still here? No? Well, come back, because today I want to dig a little bit deeper than that. So, the opening scene immediately hits shit home as someone who knows the ending. Sad girl is visiting a dead girl's grave in an almost post-apocalyptic looking city. This is the present time in the show's timeline, and even though the anime says otherwise, the entire thing from here on out is basically a flashback until we get back to this point. After that, the first episode also gives us Whiplash, with a roller coaster ride where we get in... are introduced to absolutely the two main characters, the show's gloomy aesthetic, and this smooth motherfucker get a surprisingly well-animated concert scene, especially if you consider the rather low budget the show had, as it was being both an original show and the anime debut for writer Akifumi Kaneko, who is also known for his JRPG franchise Wild Arms, get blown up and are attacked by Babylonian aliens. We see main character 1 and Dead Girl from the opening scene die. See that Dead Girl isn't actually dead, which means that I actually need to use names now, get a musical school as our main setting, are introduced to the sort of relationship Sad Girl Miku and Dead Girl Hibiki have. See that main character 2, Tsubasa, also goes to this school despite being an idol, and shortly after we are introduced to the fact that apparently Hibiki inherited main character 1 and True Dead Girl Kanade's powers to wield the name-giving Symphogear Gungnir, giving us this meme of a shot. And thus, the stage is set. Throughout the show, we get into all kinds of trouble, like meeting antagonist 1, Chris, seeing her get abused by the overly sexualized, shape-shifting scientist and supervillain, Ryoko aka Fine, turning Chris into main character 4 after a short redemption arc, as well as finding ourselves in some politics drama between the US and Japan. We also get some nice insights into Hibiki's and Miku's relationship, as Hibiki has to keep making excuses for herself for not turning up or being late on multiple occasions, because being a magical girl and everything, of course she can't reveal her powers. That would get Miku into trouble. Yes, this is a pretty highly used trope in magical girl shows, and it's definitely one I usually dislike a lot myself. But here, it's actually quite well executed in the end, and ties in well with the show's overall theme of human connections. Though I have to say that it's probably me being blinded by my love for this series, or just my standard being low enough to see it like that, or all of the three. So, as a very brief synopsis, these are Noise. Noise are bad. Symphogears are music-powered battle armor made from so-called relics to fight Noise. Hibiki doesn't know what to do as a rookie gear user, but tries to get literal edgelord Tsubasa to warm up to her so they can fight together. Bad things and bad people happen, and thus we have the story. All of the story stuff aside though, Symphogear is a pretty wild ride, and it isn't one you will want to get off of, especially with the fucking amazing music. Seriously? This is one of the things I was talking about when I said, I took a stance that made me ignore some of the greatest strengths of the entirety of Symphogear. This OST is like the original lead developer for Minecraft. Top notch. God, someone just fucking killed me already. The music is fucking awesome and incredibly unique. From J-pop with a high arts theme, over rock with some metal influences, and Celtic electropop, all the way to background music that could come right out of a Final Fantasy game, which makes sense given Kaneko's history in the JRPG industry. Not only does the music fit into the show amazingly well, it also shares motifs all across the board and perfectly fits the occasion pretty much all the time. The way music is integrated into the narrative, as well as the previously mentioned motif sharing, gives the show a characteristic that only idol shows were really able to profit from, where inserts actually mean something in-universe. Just this time around, it's not about winning some tournament, like in Love Life or Aikatsu, but rather about fisting aliens. Idol anime have had this advantage for years, and there is a fair amount of crossover between them and magical girl anime, but the way Symphogear manages to integrate it into its more mature setting makes it all the better. The art and animation are also pretty good, especially for the earlier mentioned rather low budget the show had. I do have to concede, I watched the Blu-ray version for this rewatch, so the animation is a lot better, and yes, it does also have to be said, high budget does not instantly equal good animation, but having a really low budget doesn't help much either, and you can definitely see corners being cut all over the place. Camera movement being substituted for actual animation, or the atrocity of a keyframe shot you're seeing in the background right now are some of the worst examples, but all in all, the show handles its animation pretty well, and obviously a lot of the issues, like the ones I pointed out, get redone to at least some degree in the Blu-ray release. The fight choreography, on the other hand, is plain great, and it's simply a joy to be carried through the fights and just be immersed in the carnage that results from the slicing, shooting, and fisting of Noise. What I think is a really nice twist on common genre tropes is that the characters don't use the rather notorious attack callouts that especially many shonen and magical girls are known for. Instead, they resort to beautiful, very characteristic and fitting still cards showing the attack and its name in a style unique to every character, with Tsubasa's cards taking an old Japanese high arts style, Kanade's being comic pop art, and Chris's cards being very edgy, for lack of a better term. Obviously, these tie in with the gear users' fighting styles and previously mentioned choice of music as well, making the fights an incredible display of the show's production, not only in terms of animation, but also, again, in terms of music. For every occurrence of any insert song in this show, its voice actresses re-record the relevant parts of it to really sell the fights and the power and exertion the characters put into it. It's an absolute delight, and while expensive, a fantastic precedent to have set this early on for the rest of the show from here on out. Now, beyond what I've said about the animation, the issues that cropped up to me during the rewatch were actually far and few in between. Some people seem to think that Fine is unnecessarily stubborn in her villainous views, but honestly I have to disagree with that. As overused as the phrase, every villain is the hero of their own story might be, getting her long-forgotten Babylonian god to love her by eradicating all conflict in the world via the means of destroying all of humanity is actually kind of a solid scheme, seeing how said god himself practically disowned her as a priestess to him when he shattered humanity along with the Tower of Babel, creating different languages and conflict in the same strike. This won't surprise you if you're familiar with Kaneko's previous work, but yes, as also visible in some of Symphogear's names, and pretty much the vast majority of its lore, as well as almost anything related to actually operating Symphogears, this show heavily relies on dressing itself in stories based on mythology and the origins of history. The way this is implemented is honestly kind of fascinating. Similar to Wild Arms before, Kaneko borrows a lot of actual basic facts from mythology and our limited knowledge of Mesopotamia, and uses the resulting base as a canvas to draw his own interpretations on while not abandoning said base. Hint freaking hint. This world, while probably reading way too much into it, led to countless sleepless nights for me back when I originally watched the show, and honestly this stuff still seriously intrigues me. It's very fitting to, yet heavily contrasts the show's otherwise very futuristic and clean aesthetic, as well as shrouding a lot of the main plot's background in actual mystery. Anyways, got sidetracked a little there. Getting back to the topic of issues that I was trying to point out, I don't even feel like all three main characters practically coming back from the dead for the climax is much of a stretch. Sure, it doesn't make sense in a more mature setting like this, but not only does that fact drown in hype, it also perfectly fits the idea of music-powered magical girls and the show's themes of bonds and selflessness, and leads to some of the most over-the-top attacks I personally have ever seen in anime, let alone magical girl anime. Another precedent I'm very happy this season set for the rest of the show, though I will admit that this iteration of them is very clumsily designed. The climax being unrealistic legitimately gets lost in the fact that it is the climax, and the fact that it manages to pull this kind of overshadowing off is quite the testament to not how necessarily well, but definitely firmly Symphogear is written. Fuck, the show even manages to cut out the classic nut for the OP moment for the true final climax. And yes, this show has 2 climaxes in 2 episodes, the first of which does actually use the opening song Synchro Gazer. And no, that's not a poorly written sex joke, because if it was, I would have said countless instead of 2, so we could all laugh at lesbians. Haha, now that that's out of our system, let's go back to trying to complain about this show. Some people seem to think the curve at which our characters get stronger is too steep at times, to the point of calling it out as power creep. While I can totally see where they're coming from, I honestly don't think that way, because not only are pretty much all the Symphogear wielders except for Hibiki already quite used to fighting, they're of course getting better with time, and there's also a fair few somewhat substantial time skips here, justifying a sharp increase in abilities, though again, I do have to concede, an actual failure thrown somewhere in there would have been very nice. But even with that, in my opinion, Symphogear manages to perfectly balance this steadily rising amount of spectacle and power for the main characters that builds up to the climax really well. Heck, even the second season G managed to really up the ante in spectacle while not forgetting the story that keeps things coherent. Hint freaking hint. Anyways, the one true issue I've had with this show after rewatching it was the ending scene, where we are catapulted back to sad girl crying over dead girl's grave in episode 1, because now we get to see what happens afterwards. Miku gets ripped out of her mourning session by a scream. Following it, she finds a woman surrounded by noise and helps her flee from the pack, just to get surrounded by a bigger pack afterward. But fret not, we aren't killing any characters quite yet, because just as time starts running out for the two, the noise are reduced to tiny shreds of split by the attack of a Symphogear. Yes, even after blowing up in space, all three main characters are still alive and well in the single most unexplained asshole in the entirety of Symphogear. They explain the entire situation as, "Oh, sorry, we had to go undercover and pretend we were dead because government cover-up." Something that is also more directly shown to us in the OVA for the second season, but I say bullshit, because Miku is the single closest person to Hibiki, and even got drawn into this entire thing halfway through the season. How was she not informed about this? To me, this is honestly much more of an upset than any of the other assholes the show manages to pull over its runtime, because it doesn't fit that central theme of human connection and bonds. There's a reason the manga only covers the story of this first season up to its climax, and then stops there. Anyways, all in all, I have to say that, against my expectations, rewatching Symphogear really hasn't changed my original opinion that much. Yes, I've noticed many more flaws that I didn't see before, but I still couldn't really care about them much, either because of nostalgia or just because I had such a good time, especially now that I let myself actually enjoy the music for once. Or I'm just looking into it too much and was still suffering from the whiplash I got from episode 1 and thus couldn't give a shit if I wanted to. Whichever it is, it doesn't really matter, as my enjoyment was just as high in any case. So, in the end, even through all the flaws the show does in a critical sense have, if I had to score the show based purely on personal enjoyment, I'd give it 4 out of 5 unnecessary ass shots and a rape lawsuit.